Alright, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Today, inshallah, we're going to discuss the blessings of the Quran. We're going to talk about three sides of it. We're going to talk about reading the Quran. We're going to talk about memorizing the Quran. And we're going to talk about the certain surahs and what certain ahadith were mentioned about them. We're going to talk about some of the authentic and the non-authentic ahadith. So hopefully our time is going to be enough to actually discuss those sides. So please bear with us, inshallah, and we'll. First one is the issue of blessing and reading and memorizing the Quran. When we're talking about reading the Quran, there's really a lot to say about reading the Quran, the impact and the influence that it actually has on the person. I put here the hadith in Arabic and the words in Arabic, so I will translate it for you in order for you to be able to understand what is being said. So in the hadith where Anas ibn Malik narrated that the Prophet ﷺ actually said that there are certain people that are considered, like you could consider that they are people that are devoted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're people that are chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Prophet ﷺ was asked, well, who are these people? And the Prophet ﷺ responded, they're actually the people of the Quran. They are the people of Allah and they're the chosen ones. They're the chosen ones of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, Al-Manawi, who is actually one of the famous scholars for Fath al-Qadir and also one Hanafi scholar, very famous one, he actually said that the people of Allah or the chosen people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are actually the people that memorized the Quran and those that act upon the Quran. Those are the ones that are the saint ones or the pious ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had chosen to be the ones that are near Him, and they were called that way in order to give them the honor. Just as the word Baytullah, just as when we would say that this is the house of Allah, it is actually to show that it was chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually resides there. So when we look at those sides, who's the chosen person? You could always see that it's always something that's related to the Quran. Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, this is not the Tirmidhi that is the author or at least the scholar for Sunan al-Tirmidhi. This is a different scholar. He actually said, and this would be in the person that reads the Quran and his own heart was actually free and purified from his own transgressions, from the different transgressions, and this is only true about a person who had purified himself from the outside and the inside of himself from all the different sins, and he beautified himself with the obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's when they become the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now this, you could see, is really important. It's not just an issue about reading the Quran, although that is a big blessing, but it's actually to let the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lighten the inside and bring light on the outside. So the question is, well, how does the Quran actually affect the heart? A scholar, his name is Al-Adri, he actually says it is very important that every single person that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had taught him the Quran and the blessings of the Quran, and whoever carries the Quran, in other words, they're actually always connected to the Quran, and they want to be from the people of the Quran and the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to be part of the Quran. They have to have the Quran to be the spring of their hearts, and to always build within their hearts that faith inside their hearts and therefore they always have to have the behavior. The mannerism is actually the manners of the Quran. The manners of the Quran would be the ones that are appearing, that are influencing, that are reflecting what is on the inside. In other words, the light of the Quran is reflecting on their behavior, and therefore they would be distinguished from all the people around them, from the people that don't memorize the Quran. Now, when we're talking about how does it affect the heart, we're actually talking about that there's there's no way, if you don't hear that, you don't know what the words are, saying, or what the words are of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's actually no way that you're going to be able to apply them. Which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling you that the change actually starts by reading and putting those words in your heart. That's when you'll be able, with repetition, you'll be able to let those words take place in affecting your behavior and affecting who you are and what you are. So how long do I have to complete the Quran for? How long should be the most time, and how short the time should be? Well, the scholars actually said no longer than a month or 40 days. So every time we're talking about reading all the Quran, completing the Quran, it should be in no longer than a month or 40 days. Al-Bukhari actually narrated in a hadith that was narrated by Abdullah ibn Amr, where he had actually said that the Prophet ﷺ had said, اقرأ القرآن في كل شهر قال إني أطيق أكثر فما زال حتى قال في ثلاث. The Prophet ﷺ said, read the Quran every single month. So the Sahabi responded, but I could do more. He continued to say what he said, and then he said, at least in 3. In other words, don't read it in less than 3 days. Now you could see that the Prophet ﷺ, when he said in 3, that's where the scholars had differences of opinions on what is the least. And in the end, there are some evidences to support that 7 days. The 7 days at least, read the Quran once every 7 days. This is at least. And if you had if you had some, probably had some exceed a month. The other thing is that the Prophet ﷺ, of course, was telling us to read the Quran always and make it part of our life in order to help us. You see, whatever you say is going to affect, and it's going to come out in your behavior. And that's why if you look at the hadith, and when they're talking about abstaining from illicit talk, or abstaining from gossiping, abstaining from all those different talks, it is really because it eventually starts coming out into your behavior. It starts reflecting who you are. The more you say the type of good talk, you'll be a good person. What you say is who you are. They would say, what you eat, you are what you eat. But here we would say, you are what you say. If you read the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you'll become the light that speaks in the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Imam Ahmad actually mentioned that Uthman radiallahu anhu, the Sahabi, the Prophet ﷺ's companion, he said, ما أحب أن يأتي علي يوم وليلة إلا أنظر في كتاب الله. Uthman bin Affan used to say that I would hate that any day or night would pass without me looking at the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning that he would read no matter what the circumstances were. And Ibn Kathir, the famous Mufassir, actually said that it was hated that any man would pass any day without looking at the word and the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now there are so many things that might take away our time, and we could get busy, but the Prophet ﷺ actually said that if the servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually gets sick, gets ill, or goes on a journey, but they had a schedule that they were always doing in reading the Quran, or in probably Qiyam al-Layl, or probably doing a good thing. But because of the illness, or because of traveling, they weren't able to do that schedule and complete that schedule. So the Prophet ﷺ actually said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would actually record the exact same reward that they were doing, because they were living based on a certain schedule for a long time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would actually record as if they were still on the same schedule when they were doing things when they were healthy, or when they were residents in that place. Now, when we're talking about when we're talking about reading the Quran, there's also one thing to know. Well, what is the importance of memorizing the Quran? And that's why I actually want to see it right there, and I'm going to go over it, and I could see that. Inshallah, let me see if I can share the page with the other group. And here we go. When we're looking at the words, I thought it was easier for you to actually see it on a page and me go over it. So what is the importance of memorizing the Quran? When we're talking about memorizing the Quran, I'll tell you, it is not easy. It takes a lot of time. And I remember when I was memorizing, it was really tough even on the jaw. The jaw starts getting tired from all the repetition and keep on repeating. I remember my daughter when she was a young girl, I was telling her about the importance of dua and making the dua, and then I saw her putting her hands, and I said, what's your dua? And she said, I made the dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not make my jaw hurt when I'm memorizing the Quran. She was only 6 years old at the time. That was her dua. And subhanallah, when we're talking about memorizing, it takes a lot of repetition, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of dedication. It is not easy to memorize the Quran whatsoever. It takes a lot of dedication, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of giving up on so many things. You give up on so many of the things that you might enjoy, so many of the things that you would rather do, and to actually go and sit and read and read and read and memorize and repeat all that, it takes a lot. So what's so important about memorizing the Quran? Now, memorizing the Quran was actually a sunnah. It was the behavior of the Sahaba, the behavior of many of the Salihin, the behavior of the scholars, and it continued to be until the time of today, that if you wanted to be a scholar on Quran, the first thing you have to start with was really memorizing the Quran. And even Jibril alayhi salam was actually coming to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam once a year or twice in the last year that the Prophet ﷺ was in order to review the Quran with the Prophet ﷺ. When you're actually memorizing the Quran, you're memorizing and you are remembering. That is actually your way to free you from and protect you and save you from hellfire. The Prophet ﷺ actually said, if this Quran was put in a leather sack and then it was thrown in fire, this is just a resemblance. It was some like a similar thing for us to understand what it would look like in hellfire. The Prophet ﷺ said it will not burn. It will not burn because of the Quran inside. This is not saying let's put a Quran inside a sack, and a leather sack, and throw it in the fire. Will it burn or not? It will burn, because this is the Prophet ﷺ was just giving you that comparison of what things are like in Yawm al-Qiyamah. The Prophet ﷺ also said that the Quran on Judgment Day will be the one to speak and defend you and intercede on your behalf. Where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, read the Quran, because on Judgment Day it will intercede for those that were holding on to it, for those that were reading it constantly. In other words, it becomes the words to defend you, but only if you act upon it. On Judgment Day, the Quran not only protects you from hellfire, but it also raises and elevates your level in Jannah, where the Prophet ﷺ actually said that the person that is holding on to the Quran, he will be told, Iqra warqa, read and get elevated. It's exactly like you would go up on stairs, where one stair and the more you read, the faster the stairs go, and the more you read, the higher you will be in going up the stairs, kind of like an escalator. You will continue to read, and as long as you continue to read, the escalator is going to take you farther and farther higher up. And the hadith also says, وَرَتِّلْ كَمَا كُنْتَ تُرَتِّلُ فِي الدُّنْيَا, and recite, just as you were reciting in this dunya, because your level and your position is going to be based on the last ayah that you recite. Based on the last ayah that you recite. The person that is reciting the Quran doesn't only get elevated only in the akhirah, but also gets elevated even in this dunya, or so it should be. Where when we're looking at in fiqh or in the ahadith, the one that is supposed to be the imam and the person to lead the salah is actually the person that is أحفظهم لكتاب الله, the one that actually memorized the most in the Quran. And that's why when we're looking at who should I elevate above all, it is really the one that memorized the Quran, in where the Prophet ﷺ actually says it is part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's honor, part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's honor, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would that people would actually respect and honor those that have the elderly, the Muslim elderly, the older in age, and those that carried the Quran. When it talks about carried the Quran, this is not talking about a book in where you carry it in your hand, but this is talking about the person that is constantly holding on to their Quran to memorize it in order to have it inside their hearts. Memorization actually takes a lot of effort. That in the hadith that we mentioned earlier, where the Prophet ﷺ actually says that there are two people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had chosen from all the people. And the Sahaba asked, who are these people? So he said, Hum Ahlul Quran. They're the people of Quran. They're the people that had memorized the Quran. They are the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had chosen. When we're looking at reading the Quran, why is it such a big deal? Why is it such an important thing? Remember, these words were actually the words that were revealed onto the Prophet ﷺ. These words are what really made the Prophet ﷺ be the Prophet. In other words, the words that made the Prophet ﷺ be the Prophet, they were through the wahi. When you carry it, when it's in your heart, you won't be a prophet, but you will be at the level of somebody that has the light of a prophet, the torch of the Salihin, and the torch of the prophets, and the torch of al-Wahi. And that's how that person becomes the light and the chosen one of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we're looking at memorizing the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually mentioned in Surah Abasa, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says that those that, of course, in Surah Abasa, that mentions them that they are from Safarat al-Kiram al-Barara. And this is where the hadith comes in. The Prophet ﷺ actually says the example and the comparison between the person that reads the Quran and he had memorized it is exactly like the Malaika. Those are the Safarat al-Kiram al-Barara. The Safarat al-Kiram al-Barara, the ones that are near Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those would be the ones to actually be at the level of the angels in their closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is really important to mention when the Prophet ﷺ actually says that any group of people that would sit in any house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reading the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they're learning it, they're learning the tafsir, they're taking the moment to learn the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet ﷺ says, إِلَّا حَفَّتْهُمُ الْمَلَائِكَةِ. The Malaika would not sit amongst them, but they would sit surrounding them. It's like that protection. It's like surrounding them. So they left their place and they left their position in being in the heavens to actually sit with those that are reviewing and memorizing the Quran. Why? Because they know that this is even closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than being in the heavens right there. This gets them closer in their position. And nazalat alayhim as-sakina, and they would have the sakina, the tranquility, the feeling on the inside, the blessed feeling, the feeling where you're calm, you're feeling at peace. وَنَزَلَتْ عَلَيْهِمُ السَّكِينَةُ وَذَكَرَهُمُ اللَّهُ فِي مَنْ عِنْدَهُ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would mention them and would mention their names and would mention who they are with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You do your dhikr on earth, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would mention your name in the heavens right there. When we're talking about the Quran, Allah subhanahu the Prophet ﷺ actually said that this Quran actually elevates people, and the same Quran may condescend and put down others. How does it elevate certain people and condescend or put down other people? It will elevate those that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had blessed them with memorization and also acting upon the words. And those that don't memorize and those that are not considerate over the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be the ones to lose on the blessing, and they'll be the ones to be down and in the low end of the people. When we're looking at so how do I start with all this? How do I put it as in an effort? Well, it starts with actually feeling and wanting to get that blessing. Wanting to get that blessing, it will start by actually making you want to do it. You start by understanding the importance of that. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ actually said, La hasada illa fitnatain. Don't envy anybody but in two things. One, that was given the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mentions one of them that was given the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they would read it throughout the day and throughout the night. And he mentions another person that actually was given wealth and they would be donating it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And another hadith would actually mention a person that was given the ilm. But you could see when he said, رَجُلًا آتَاهُ اللَّهُ الْكِتَابِ, the one that was actually given the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it starts with you knowing the position, the importance of actually memorizing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ actually mentions in numerous ahadith where he said, whoever reads every single letter, whoever reads any letter from the Quran, from the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, every letter is actually considered a reward, is actually considered a deed, and every deed is multiplied by 10. In other words, if you are reading one ayah, we're talking about not alif lam mim as one letter, but we're talking about alif as one letter, lam as one letter, and mim as one letter. My sister was actually telling me that she was in al-Masjid al-Aqsa one time, and she saw an elderly lady holding the Quran, but she was holding the Quran upside down. She was going over the letters really fast, and the line after line, line after line. And then that was in Masjid al-Aqsa. My sister told me that she was asking her, can you actually read? And she said, leave me alone, I'm busy. So she said, can I just help you at least read it in the right way? So she flipped the words, she flipped the Quran for her to actually hold it in the right way. And she said, leave me alone. She said, yeah, I'm just helping you carry it the right way. And then she continued. And then my sister said, Hajja, can you read? She said, leave me alone, I said. And my sister said, you might want to go slower in going over the lines. How about that? And she went slower over the lines. And then she said, a little slower. And she went slower over the lines. And she said, and then when she finished, my sister, she noticed that she finished going over many, many, many pages slowly. And my sister came to her and she said, Hajja, can you actually read? And she said, no, I can't. She said, so why were you going over the lines if you can't read? She said, at least I will go over the lines even if I can't read. At least I will tell Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I put the effort in going over the lines and at least getting the light of looking at the letters. This really made me shiver because, there are certain people, subhanAllah, really simple people that will put an effort. Even if they can't read, she wanted to spend time in at least going over the letters and at least going over the words, even if she can't read them. Take the effort to read, take the effort to actually look at those words. And the Prophet ﷺ actually said, build your hearts, build your hearts with the Quran, and fill your homes with blessing. Fill your homes with the blessing of the Quran. And that's why Ka'b actually said, عليكم بالقرآن فإنه فهم العقل. In other words, take the Quran. Take the Quran as the main source of ilm, because it is what brings in comprehension to your mind and understanding to your mind. It is actually the light of wisdom, and it is actually the source and the spring of knowledge. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent it as the last book out of all the revelations. And he said about the Torah, يا محمد إني منزل عليك التوراة حديثا تفتح بها أعينا عميا وآذانا صما وقلوبا غلفا. He said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Torah, O Muhammad, I'm going to reveal a newer Torah that you will open the eyes of people. And remember, Ka'b was actually Jewish, and that's why he's talking about the Torah here. That you will open with those words eyes that were blind, and ears that were deaf, and hearts that were sealed. Now, Ka'b, like I said, was actually a Jew, and that's why he's talking about the words of the Torah, and he has the knowledge what other Sahaba did not actually have. There were a number of different Sahaba that actually were Jewish and became Muslim, and Ka'b is actually one of them. There are many beautiful stories about those Sahaba that were Jewish and had become Muslim. Now we look at this. We look at now this part of the web page right here, and it's actually talking about the different ahadith that are authentic ahadith that speak about certain surahs that were considered as having a certain blessing more than other surahs. Now, I would like to mention that there were many ahadith that were not as authentic as those ahadith. So I'm just going to mention some of those authentic ahadith that talked about certain surahs, but the majority of the ahadith that speak about the blessings of other surahs or certain surahs more than others, majority of the ahadith are not authentic, but you can use those as an inspiration to say, for example, you can use that as an inspiration to actually learn from them, but they're not necessarily authentic. But these ahadith, we're going to talk about the ahadith that are authentic. So here's a hadith where Ibn Abbas actually narrated, it's an authentic hadith, that Jibreel alayhi salam, when he was sitting with the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ actually heard a loud sound on the top of his head. And then he said, this is the door of the heavens just opened today. And it was never opened before this day, except today. And an angel came down, and he said, this is an angel that had just come down to earth. He never came down but today. He greeted and said, أبشر بنورين أوتيتهما. He said, glad tidings, I've come with good news, with two lights that you were given. No prophet have ever come with this whatsoever. The Fatiha al-Kitab, Surah al-Fatiha, and the ends of Surah al-Baqarah. Any لن بحرف منها إلا أعطيته. Every single letter that you actually read, you will get, that is the light of that. Now, the two last ayat from Surah Al-Baqarah are actually the ayat. I'm going to add it right here so you could see it. The two last ayat are basically the ayat in Surah Al-Baqarah I'm going to read it right here. آمن الرسول بما أنزل إليه من ربه والمؤمنون كل آمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله لا نفرق بين أحد من رسله وقالوا سمعنا وأطعنا غفرانك ربنا وإليك المصير لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. I'm going to translate those ayat. It would be very hard for me to translate it without even looking at the words. آمن الرسول بما أنزل إليه من ربه. The prophet, peace be upon him, the prophet had believed in what was revealed unto him from his Lord Almighty, and so did the believers. Every one of them had believed in Allah, the angels, the books, and the prophets, and we do not distinguish between any of the prophets, and they would say, we hear and we obey. Pardon us, غفرانك. We seek your forgiveness, O Lord Almighty, because to you shall be our return. God Almighty, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. God Almighty does not obligate anyone beyond their scope. Every single deed that they will do, they will be rewarded for, and every single action that they commit, they will be held accountable for. Lord Almighty, do not hold us accountable. Do not burden us in nasina, if we forget or if we commit a mistake. O Lord Almighty, do not burden us with something that we cannot handle. كما حملت ولا تحمل علينا. Do not burden us with burdens as those that you have put on the ones that have come before us, and do not give us more than what we can handle, and pardon us and forgive us and shed your mercy on us. You are our authority. فانصرنا, and give us victory. We're actually looking at those words. We're actually seeing how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is connecting your heart with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to feel the words and let those words rub into your action. And when we're looking at the Fatiha, you could see that this hadith that I had mentioned was actually narrated by Muslim, meaning it's an authentic hadith. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ actually said, not in the Torah, there's nothing similar that was revealed to Surah Al-Fatiha, not in the Torah, and not even in the Gospels, and not in the Psalms, and not in the Quran, anything similar to it. It is actually the 7 ayat, the 7 pearls the 7 ayat, which are actually Surah Al-Fatiha. And this hadith is muttafaqun alayh, meaning that it was narrated by both Bukhari and Muslim. And that means it is the highest ranking authentic hadith that you could actually find. In the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, the Quran, qasamtu salah was actually split between me and my servant into two parts. And every single part, my servant, when they're reading the Fatiha, they would get what they had asked for. If my servant says, all praise be to the Lord of the worlds, Allah Almighty will respond, my servant had praised me. If he would say, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the most merciful, most beneficent, the Lord Almighty would say, my servant had praised me. If he would say, the Lord of the world, the Lord of Judgment Day, Allah Almighty will say, my servant had praised me. And if he would say, that is, the servant would say, it is you that we seek refuge in, it is you that we worship, I would say, this is between me and my servant will have whatever he had asked for. Then if he would say, guide us to the right path, and the path of those that you had blessed, and not the path of those that you were not pleased of, and not the path of those that were misguided. Allah Almighty will respond, this is for my servant. In other words, I will answer it, and I will respond that for my servant, and he gets what he asked for. You could see this hadith is narrated in Muslim, in Sahih Muslim. There's really a lot to say, but you could see there's so many ahadith that are life. I'm not going to go over those. And in Surah Al-Baqarah, I'm just going to choose one hadith of every surah, just to help us at least get to know them. The Prophet ﷺ about Surah Al-Baqarah, in the hadith that was narrated by Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ actually says, don't let your rooms and your homes be as graves, that don't let your homes be your graves, because in other words, read a surah that is a surah that the shaitan will actually run away from, which is Surah Al-Baqarah. And this hadith is narrated in Sahih Muslim. And of course, the ayah that we just read, Amana Rasul ma unzila ilayhi min Rabbih, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud actually narrated that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, whoever reads 2 ayat from the ending of Surah Al-Baqarah during a night, that should suffice. And this hadith is actually in Bukhari. The Prophet ﷺ actually said, whoever reads 1 ayah, this is the ayat al-Kursi, after every salah, that obligatory salah, there would be no barrier between him and entering Jannah except death. Except death. Now you could see this hadith is narrated by Nasa'i, and it was regarded as authentic by Al-Albani. In other words, this hadith is actually authentic. When we're looking at different surah, you could see, like in Surah Ali Imran, and other surahs where I'm just going to go really quick with the Prophet ﷺ taking the time to also ponder in certain ayat. The Prophet ﷺ actually said there are certain surahs that gave me some gray hairs. I had gray hairs from certain surahs, and they were telling the Prophet ﷺ, you could see some gray hair coming out on your hair. And he said it was actually Surah Hud, Surah Al-Waqi'ah, Surah Hud and its sisters, Surah Hud, Al-Waqi'ah, Al-Mursalat, and Amma Yatasa'alun, and Ida Shamsu Kuwirat. The Prophet ﷺ actually mentioned this in a number of ahadith. Really, you could see it's a number of ahadith that were mentioned. I'm going to go over Surah Al-Isra. Sayyidah Aysha said that the Prophet ﷺ did not go to sleep until he would read 2 surahs, Az-Zumar and Bani Israel, Surah Al-Zumar and Surah Bani Israel. By the way, I do plan to give the tafsir for Surah Al-Zumar, inshallah, after Surah Al-Ahzab. And Surah Bani Israel is actually Surah Al-Isra. Surah Bani Israel is Surah Al-Isra. The Prophet ﷺ, every night he would not go to sleep except after reading the surah that had al-musabbihat, the words that had sabbaha, the surahs that start with sabbaha. And he would say that there's actually an ayah in it that is better, and in other words, blessed more than 1,000 ayat. And the surahs that are part of those musabbihat are actually the surahs such as Surah Al-Isra, Al-Hadid, Al-Hashr, Al-Saf, Al-Jumu'ah, Al-Taghabun, and Al-A'la. But I'll try to go faster. Surah Al-Kahf. There are a number of ahadith that mentioned about Surah Al-Kahf, where the Prophet ﷺ actually says, Man hafidha 10 ayat min awwal Surah Al-Kahf, usima min ad-Dajjal. Whoever memorizes 10 ayat from Surah Al-Kahf, they will be protected from the fitna, from the trials of ad-Dajjal. And in another narration, it actually said, Min akhir Surah Al-Kahf, in other words, last 10 ayat from the ending of Surah Al-Kahf. And this hadith, you could see it's narrated by Muslim. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ about Surah Al-Kahf actually says, whoever reads Surah Al-Kahf, كانت له نورا يوم القيامة. It will be a light for them on Judgment Day. The light expands as from the distance that he's in until Mecca. So in other words, if you're in the US and you're reading it, the light would be as far as from your place to all the way to Mecca. And whoever reads 10 ayat from the ending of Surah Al-Kahf, even if the Dajjal will to come out, he would not be affected by it. And so this is about the surah. I'm just going to focus on the surah right there. Now there's so many different ahadith and different ahadith. I guess I'll do the one about Surah Tabarak as well, where the Prophet ﷺ actually says, "Inna suratan min al-Quran." There's one surah in the Quran. It has 30 ayah. It interceded for a man until it had totally made him get the forgiveness. And that surah is actually Tabarak alladhi biyadihi al-mulk. That surah is actually Surah Al-Mulk. Now I want to go farther. In Surah Yasin there aren't really any ahadith sahiha in the, which doesn't mean Surah Yasin is not a good surah, but there aren't any ahadith sahiha that are authentic about the blessings and Surah Yasin. So we'll just go over it really quick right here. I'm going to go really quick, and most of those hadith that relating other surahs, you could see they're actually not authentic. But I'm going to talk about the hadith sahih that were mentioned in Surah Al-Ikhlas, which is Qul Huwallahu Ahad. The Prophet ﷺ actually says, are you not capable of reading third of the Quran every night? So they said, and how are we going to read third of the Quran? And the Prophet ﷺ said, read Qul Huwallahu Ahad. That is equivalent to third of the Quran. And you could see this hadith is actually narrated in Sahih Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ, a man came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, "O Prophet of Allah, I love reading Qul Huwallahu Ahad." So the Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna hubbaka iyyaha yudkhiluka al-jannah." Your love for Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad, Surah Al-Ikhlas, is what is going to bring you into Jannah. In another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever reads Surah Al-Fatiha, Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad, until he would read it 10 times, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would build them a castle in Jannah. And this is, for those, even if you didn't memorize a lot of Quran, this is the least that you could do. Read Qul Huwallahu Ahad 10 times, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will build you a castle in Jannah. There's so many different hadith sahih, but we already passed almost 50 minutes of our time, so we'll answer questions inshallah. Like I said, there's so many different hadith, so we'll inshallah I actually wanted to, here we go, I wanted to actually do this hadith. We'll end it right here. So Mu'adh ibn Abdullah actually said, we went out in a rainy night in a near rate, and it was very dark. They went to seek the Prophet ﷺ in order for the Prophet ﷺ to pray for them. So they got to the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ said, "Qul," say. And he said, I just stayed quiet. I didn't say anything. So the Prophet ﷺ said, "Qul," say. So he said, I didn't say anything. So then he said, "Qul." And then the Prophet ﷺ told him, say. And he said, what should I say? So the Prophet ﷺ said, say Qul Huwallahu Ahad, and do al-mu'awwidhatayn, which is Qul a'udhu bi rabbil falaq and Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas. Every time you go, in other words, into night, and every morning, 3 times, it will protect you from all matters. Now the reason why he was talking about will protect you, because it seems like this Sahabi, he said it was a dark and a rainy night. In other words, spooky. Alright? So the Prophet ﷺ told him, it will takfika min kulli shay, will protect you from everything. The Qul Huwallahu Ahad, Qul a'udhu bi rabbil falaq, and Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas. It will protect you from everything. And of course, that is the ruqya as well. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know it's probably a long lecture. Sorry about that. I hope it wasn't boring. So jazakumullah khairan everyone. I'd be happy to answer any questions. No questions. Alright, so jazakumullah khairan everyone, and barakallahu. Oh, Sister Mish'al raised her hand. So Sister Mish'al, go ahead. I don't know how you do that, so let's go like that. There we go. Go ahead, Sister Michelle.
Assalamu alaikum
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sister, so you mentioned that there's a hadith where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that on Yawm al-Qiyamah, Allah will tell us to recite and elevate. Is this what was memorized or in accordance with what was recited even by looking in the Quran in our life?
So, generally speaking, when we're talking about reciting, that's one part, when you keep on reciting. But that hadith, most scholars actually said it was exclusive for those that memorize.
Okay.
Yeah, most of the scholars actually said it was for those that memorize, but that doesn't mean that if you don't recite, you will not be included, because the more you recite, you will memorize. My grandmother memorized all the Quran, and I'll tell you, she did not spend, the time that we would normally spend in reading the ayah like 30 or 40 times or 33 times. No, it was because she was constantly reading the Quran. She memorized the words because she was constantly reading them. So by constant recitation, you will find yourself there and memorize the Quran.
Okay, fine. Okay. So it is that which we've memorized.
Yep, that you had memorized.
Jazakallah khair.
Wa iyyakum. All right. So let me see. I think people also would the reading equate to reciting? Well, reading is reciting. So if you're reading the Quran, you're reciting the Quran. It's the same thing. So it's I'm assuming that Sister Lewis, you actually mean by that memorization. So memorization takes a lot of recitation. It takes a lot of reading, and it takes a lot of repetition in order to get there. So is that what, if you're reading once, is it equivalent to somebody that read 33 times an ayah and probably even more to get that into our minds? Well, definitely the person that read it and memorized it is actually going to get the higher reward, because they've repeated it so many times. Yes, this is actually recorded. I will be putting it up on YouTube, inshallah, and I will be sending the link, inshallah. All right, so assalamu alaikum everyone, and jazakumullah khairan wa barakallahu feekum.